Off we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our seminar. Today, our speaker is Chance Bonar. He is an advising fellow at the University of Virginia, having taught before that at Tufts University and within the Harvard Divinity School, and having been a researcher at Dumbarton Oaks in the past. Chance has completed his PhD at Harvard with the thesis that was just published with the CUP, God, Slavery, and Early Christianity, Divine Possession, and Ethics in the Shepherd of Hermas. Today we get to hear from his next book project. Chance, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me really quickly bring up my slideshow and we will get started. Okay, how does that look to everyone? Okay, good. Great. So first, thank you to Dan Bedovici for inviting me to come speak during the Genaut online seminar. Recently, I've been working on a book project that explores the literary history, the reception history from antiquity to modernity of Onesimus, Philemon's enslaved person mentioned in Paul's letter to Philemon. And what brought me to this project was working alongside a scholar of Syriac Apocrypha, Jacob Lawler, on a new translation of the Byzantine Greek martyrdom of Onesimus, as well as realizing how little work had been done examining the reception of Onesimus outside of two very distinct time periods, his early Christianity and the US Civil War. Understandably, for example, Marian Beavis's book is a good example of someone who's looking at Onesimus in first century context, and then Onesimus, our brother, a good example of people who are thinking about the reception of the letter to Philemon and the figure of Onesimus, especially within kind of the experience of Blackness in US history. And understandably, right, scholars of the New Testament and early Christianity have talked at length about Paul's letter to Philemon to a great degree, and also to a lesser degree about its reception by the Church Fathers. Especially scholars like D. Francois Tolmy have taken a particular interest in Philemon's patristic reception, demonstrating how Philemon became a text that both had to be defended by the likes of Chrysostom and Jerome for its canonical value, as well as became a primary text for the study of Paul's rhetorical persuasive techniques. And scholars of the New Testament or American religious history have rightly been invested in how biblical texts and figures were evoked by abolitionists or by pro-slavery white supremacists to justify their view on the proper relationship between slavery and Christianity. However, I'm most interested in what's happening after the 4th century. How do Christians keep expanding the story world of Onesimus beyond mere reception of the letter to Philemon? What value do they find in this story? And how do they attempt to fill these narrative gaps left behind by Paul's really brief letter? So here I want to introduce us to a few texts and inscriptions that highlight the expansiveness of the Onesimus tradition in late antiquity and throughout the medieval period. I'll be brief since this material covers 2 chapters in a forthcoming book, but I hope that it provides some helpful overview of what's out there and how we might make sense of this textual data. So I'll start with an introduction to the Byzantine Greek martyrdom of Onesimus before turning to the development of Onesimus's martyr tradition in Greek, Arabic, Armenian, and Ethiopic Synaxaria and Menologia, as Onesimus's story became incorporated into the liturgical and calendrical tradition of Eastern churches. I'll end with a few notes about the few inscriptions that may point to veneration of Onesimus in late antiquity. So to start off, the martyrdom of Onesimus. Before the composition of this text, there was already a small tradition about the martyrdom of Onesimus in antiquity. In the Thalian apparatus, shown here, it's kind of messy to date, but I understand it to be a 4th century text. The prologue to Philemon claims that Onesimus, quote, became a martyr for Christ in the city of Rome, while Tertullus held eparchic authority, and he endured martyrdom by his decree through the breaking of his legs. Before this point, Onesimus doesn't appear as a martyr, but rather only as a figure that writers turn to in order to justify their treatment of persons in their historical context based on their understanding of how Paul would have treated Onesimus and Philemon. So the martyrdom of Onesimus, which emerged sometime in the 8th or 9th centuries, and developed after that into what Craig Hansen, who first published versions of these texts in the 70s, called a revised version, came about later in the 11th or 12th centuries, start to play out this story a little bit more. So just to give us an idea of what this looks like, most Greek versions of the martyrdom of Onesimus follow a really similar narrative structure as a martyr narrative, and they have kind of 7 consistent plot points. There's an introductory remark that celebrates those who are capable of refuting the devil. There's a citation, a pretty extensive one, of Paul's letter to Philemon, a trial scene between the Roman eparch Tertullus and Onesimus, a speech by Onesimus that defends his Christian virtues and opposes idol worship. After this point, Tertullus exiles Onesimus, typically to Puteoli, sometimes an unnamed island, where he continues to preach to the local population. This angers Tertullus, who ends up killing him. So he becomes martyred on February 15th, which becomes his martyr date. And at the end, he's buried by a wealthy Roman woman. So there are 2 main points I want to make about how the martyrdom of Onesimus narrativizes Onesimus's life and death, and especially given my own interest in slavery studies, how this text is framed by discourses of slavery, mastery, and Christian piety. So the first thing I want to focus on is the opening sequence. Before diving into the story of Onesimus's conversion and martyrdom, the anonymous narrator of the martyrdom text frames the narrative in terms of slavery and mastery. So to begin, they start by celebrating when enslaved persons demonstrate proper piety. And just to show this here, one also rejoices when the enslaved race is recognized for their piety, whenever by loyalty they, having rubbed against the devil's spikes, refute the one who revolted against the enslaver, the despot. An evil enslaved person who clings to falsely called lordship. For whoever is humbly bowed to slavery in a free manner finds himself to be an enslaver of the tyrant-loving and vengeful demon. So this opening section, its vocabulary is pretty easy to overlook, especially because in Craig Hansen's 1970s translation of a version of this text, he translates enslaved race as humble folk, loyalty as faith, and enslaver as lord. So my goal with offering this different translation is to offer some contrast and to highlight how the writer of the martyrdom of Onesimus treats both slavery to humans and to divine beings as central to the narration of Onesimus's life and death. The first 2 sentences of the entire text do a lot of work to frame both the devil's and Onesimus's stories, as well as to position piety in terms of slavery and mastery. So this text starts by encouraging the text's audience to praise people that it caused the enslaved race, the genaut.univie.ac.at, there we go, for expressing piety through refutation of temptations instigated by the devil. The writer presumed here, for example, that the audience constituted primarily freeborn or freed persons who weren't necessarily part of this genos of enslaved persons they were describing. Additionally, the choice to conceptualize enslaved persons as a genos is also meaningful. Right? To do so suggests that people who are among this enslaved genos have some heritable characteristics, perhaps envisioned here as being more naturally inclined to the devil's temptations. So the martyrdom text suggests that enslaved persons deserve praise for refuting what the writer considers to be an easier path for them to take. This affinity between the enslaved genos and the devil probably emerges best from this description of the devil as himself as one of God's enslaved persons, right, who revolted or withdrew himself. The verb here, apostanta, is being used from God, the despot who's over him. And in a later version of the text editor changes this a little bit to specifically present the devil as a runaway, hos apostatein, a term that's used both for political rebels and for enslaved persons who have attempted to self-emancipate. So the devil in this text, just at the beginning in the preface, is characterized as a figure who rejected the authority of the rightful despot and instead claimed this falsely called lordship of his own in an attempt to establish authority that isn't derived from the enslaver. So the writer imagines that enslaved persons would relate to the actions of the devil, like considering rebellion and flight from one's enslaver and seeking to become autonomous. So accordingly, the martyrdom text seems to offer this paradoxical scenario especially in this last sentence of this preface, that whoever submits to slavery in a free manner can themselves become enslavers of the devil himself. What's left ambiguous in this statement is whether submission to slavery refers to a human's enslavement, to a human enslaver, or to God. Although the latter seems to be the case here, and I'll get into that in a little bit, that this text really is focused on presenting Onesimus as becoming enslaved to a deity rather than to Philemon. The martyrdom suggests that proper Christian piety allows enslaved persons to function with more authority than they previously had, describing them as enslavers or acting like enslavers, gaining some form of control, especially in this case, over malevolent spiritual entities. However, such a power is only deemed possible through the act of servile submission to the divine despot, as well as rejecting the attempted revolt and false lordship of the devil. So this dual status as enslaved in the body, but enslaver over the devil, sets the stage for the martyrdom text to introduce and describe Onesimus's journey as an early Christian figure who kind of exemplifies this contradiction. The second main thing I want to focus on with this text is its centerpiece. It's the dialogue between Onesimus and the Roman eparch Tertullus. So in the earliest version of this text and in later revisions of it, they offer different versions of this dialogue, both in content and in length. Just to start us off with the earliest version, Tertullus is asking this dialogue about Onesimus's identity, wanting to understand specifically why Onesimus has this sudden change of what it describes as despotism or despoteia between a human enslaver and Jesus, and wants to know what the cost of this exchange is. Additionally, Tertullus asked what Onesimus's scriptures urge him and other Christians to avoid. And Onesimus, in responding, reveals the intersection of human and divine slaveries as what Christovet has called dualology. That's a discourse of slavery that's extended beyond the human realm and deployed to make sense of how humans related to deities as well. So in his first response, for example, he makes this claim that long ago I was a domestic enslaved person, which is fitting for a human, but now I'm a prudent enslaved person of the good despotu, the good enslaver, Jesus, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Onesimus portrayed himself as having changed enslavers from Philemon to Jesus, and characterizes this as a transfer of ownership to someone who's more benevolent. And attempts to transfer from one enslaver to another are one of many ways that in late antiquity, enslaved persons historically tried to navigate and survive the crushing conditions of enslavement. It's a form of a kind of restricted form of agency among enslaved persons that's more subtle than outright revolt or self-emancipation. And while Tertullus is asking Onesimus about him being transferred from one person to another, he justifies this religio-economic exchange through his newly acquired hatred of idolatry, as well as goes on to explain to Tertullus what the cost, the timema, is of this exchange. It goes on to say that this is done through the costly blood of Jesus Christ. And here, the writer of the martyrdom interprets passages from 1 Corinthians and 1 Peter, in which both letter writers claimed that believers were purchased for the price by Jesus and ransomed through the costly blood of Christ, thinking about 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Peter 1. And as Laura Nasrallah has argued, Paul's deployment of language regarding slavery, manumission, and purchase, especially in 1 Corinthians 6 through 7, was meant to evoke for his Corinthian audience their own historical and social context, right? One in which many Corinthians were freed persons and were being told that their relationship to Jesus was built upon the logics of slavery and mastery as well. And in this case, with Onesimus, these passages from 1 Peter and from 1 Corinthians became his justification for this transfer of ownership to Jesus and his change in a moral stance against the range of supposedly the Greco-Roman practices that he lists to Tertullus immediately after. So he says, I now reject idolatry, adultery, sorcery, envy, hypocrisy, drunkenness, etc., etc. Well, the earliest version of the martyrdom text puts this monologue in Onesimus's mouth, that he's unwilling to sacrifice to the Roman god before Tertullus. There's another version that offers a little bit of a truncated account, and we can see some differences in how Onesimus describes his relationship to Philemon and Jesus. So in the earlier version that I just mentioned, there's this description of him as saying, long ago, I was a domestic enslaved person, which is fitting for a human. It's normal for people to be enslaved to someone in a domestic setting, but now I'm enslaved to Jesus Christ. A later version of this text, a later revision, the writer changes it a little bit. They say, I'm an enslaved person contrary to my human nature. However, I am truly an enslaved person and apostle of the good enslaver and savior, Jesus Christ. It feels like at least as far as I'm reading this, the editor of this later version of the martyrdom deviates in their understanding of the appropriateness of slavery as a human institution. Instead of seeing it as like fitting or likely, the word behind this is ekos, for a human to be enslaved, the editor characterizes Onesimus' enslavement as contrary to human nature. This doesn't imply that they understood humans to be free by nature necessarily, but they do emphasize that Onesimus's enslavement to Jesus and his role as an apostle, right, one who's sent out, might be understood as he's being a proxy of Jesus in this case. In this case, a lot of the rest of the martyrdom narrative follows suit in the way that Onesimus describes himself to Tertullus, that he claims to be purchased through this costly blood. He defends these Christian teachings against what he thinks are the moral failures of Roman deities and these ethical precepts that led him to reject idolatry. And this eventually leads to his martyrdom story. So in many ways, I see the martyrdom of Onesimus as representing a turning point in the reception history of Onesimus. While he began his narrative life as an enslaved person on whose behalf Paul advocates and discusses, and eventually becomes this literary and historical figure that early Christian preachers and commentators were thinking with and using to describe the letter to Philemon or try to understand the social position of enslaved people in the 4th and 5th centuries in their own communities. The growth of this martyrdom tradition around Onesimus started to craft this new narrative that celebrated and memorialized these supposed events in Onesimus's life beyond what was extractable from the letter to Philemon. Doing so allowed for stories about Onesimus to emerge that didn't primarily rely on his status as a runaway, nor on Paul's supposedly beneficent advocacy for him. Instead, Onesimus in this story, this is the first time that we kind of get him being given his own words, right? He gives this monologue about idolatry and the Roman state, his rejection of the passions, and this adds this new dimension to his story world. So as the martyrdom text spreads throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, his story and status become more solidified in a range of churches. It's incorporated into the Georgian translation of the Lectionary of Jerusalem, the Synaxarion of Constantinople, the Minologion of Basil II, and the Imperial Minologion. It's often with a description of his martyrdom via shattered legs and a polemical dialogue with Tertullus, as described in the martyrdom text. And there are regional variants that start to pop up as well from the 12th century onward. For example, he's remembered on his feast day of February 15th in the Copto-Arabic Synaxarion. And here he's depicted as an enslaved person of a Roman man named Philemon, who took Onesimus with him to help him manage his affairs, not knowing that in this case, Satan entered into Onesimus and corrupted his spirit, which led him to steal silver from his enslaver. Having fled back to Rome and encountering Paul, in this Copto-Arabic version, Onesimus has the fear of God enter into him in a way that displaces Satan from possessing him, and requested that Paul intervene with Philemon on his behalf. So when Onesimus and Paul's letter to Philemon arrive at Philemon's door, he sends Onesimus away with some money and returns him to Rome to say, go on to serve Paul until his martyrdom. And at that time in the Arabic tradition, Onesimus becomes ordained as a priest. And it ends, at least this version of the story ends with Onesimus being seized by an unnamed prefect at Rome after his martyrdom and being banished to an unnamed island. In the Armenian tradition, especially in the Armenian Synaxarion, the focus falls really heavily on the Tertullus cycle, that is, this dialogue that happens between Onesimus and the eparch. So in this story, Onesimus offers a speech before Tertullus, was incarcerated and exiled to Puteoli, and was eventually martyred and buried in a silver casket by an anonymous wealthy woman. And in the Armenian tradition, it doesn't focus as much on Onesimus's flight to Paul or the composition of the letter to Philemon, but instead claims that Onesimus only becomes a disciple of Paul after Philemon's death. So it presumes that Onesimus was manumitted after his enslaver's death. And here we get a narrative that is only occasionally present within this Onesimus story world, his incarceration by Tertullus. So in the Armenian tradition, we get this story where he's depicted as being incarcerated for 18 days, being denied food and water so as to kill him, but he reportedly takes advantage of his incarceration to convert other Romans whom Tertullus had also imprisoned and had planned to exile from the city. And one other example from the Ethiopic hagiographical and liturgical tradition that took particular interest in Onesimus is in the case of the Mashafak Kesar, is that it follows the Copto-Arabic version pretty closely, but significantly expands it. For example, the composition of Paul's letter to Philemon changes in this tradition. So unlike the martyrdom of Onesimus in the Byzantine Greek tradition, where it basically quotes a substantial portion of Philemon pretty verbatim, the Ethiopic version places new words into Paul's letter to Philemon. For example, offering statements such as, protect him, that is Onesimus, because he's a follower of Christ and a son and is in the preaching of the gospel. Forgive him his sin in stealing your property and receive him as myself. So the Ethiopic version of Paul here seemingly knows the patristic claim that Onesimus fled Philemon because he was a thief, despite this information not really being present in the letter to Philemon, but was only added in the patristic tradition. Additionally, the Ethiopic version claims that Philemon is not only a Roman man, but also traveled with Onesimus from Rome to Spain, which might be kind of a confusing geographical claim because it would mean that during these Iberian travels, Satan purportedly convinced Onesimus to steal from Philemon and then flee back, perhaps, to Rome, where he encounters Paul. And finally, the Ethiopic hagiographical tradition diverges from others by not only claiming that Onesimus was exiled to an island and preached there, but perhaps was also involved in socio-political action while in exile. So after in this case, the army captain banishes Onesimus to this island where he baptizes and preaches to most of the population, the hagiographer claims that after many rebellions, the leader of the armies for the emperor arrived on the island and sought him alive while he was teaching the faithful people about loyalty to our Lord Christ. I'm really interested in that idea that rebellions are happening on this island, and Onesimus is presented as instigating them in some way. So before concluding, I want to also point us to some often overlooked material evidence that might point to some degree to martyr veneration for Onesimus. 17th century antiquarians traveling through Caria in modern-day southwestern Turkey recorded a fragmentary inscription on a tower's wall among Byzantine-era ruins of the city of Miletus. While they initially transcribed it as Kai tu apiu martyros Onesipu, which is kind of a nonsense phrase like, and of the pair martyr Onesimus, or Onesimus. Later editors, I think, read this correctly, saying that it says, of the holy martyr Onesimus. Unfortunately, we don't know the date of this inscription. The inscription itself is now lost, just to make things more complex, and it's not clear whether or not its location on the tower wall was original, or if it was reused and happened to be placed somewhere else. Nevertheless, I think its existence suggests that there may have been some sort of veneration or shrine for Saint Onesimus in Miletus during the Byzantine Empire, likely in the latter half of the 6th century or later. For example, scholar of Miletus Philip Niewohner suggested that the inscription may be related to a large transept basilica and decorated martyr grave that was rediscovered in Miletus's necropolis in 2003. Other epigraphic evidence may also suggest that other late ancient locales became associated with Onesimus as well. For example, an undated epitaph from Theodic Thebes, which is a town in Thessaly, it reads, the resting place bearing Saint Holy or Saint Onesimus, the Koimeterion. While this epitaph was originally published as a late ancient Christian's tombstone, we might ask whether Onesimus himself was imagined by local Greek Christian communities to have died in Thessaly before the composition of the martyrdom of Onesimus and its standardization of his martyrdom narrative took place. The former might be more likely, but given material evidence found at theodic Thebes, it's possible for this to be read as a local saint tradition. For example, Aspasiadina and Denis Fezel have recorded the discovery of bronze seals, also in Phallic Thebes, that refer to a local whorehouse of Saint Onesimus, and another stele that bears the inscription bearing Saint Onesimus. So paired with this tomb of a Hagios Onesimus, perhaps Onesimus was venerated as a local martyr saint in late ancient Thessaly, despite the connection between Onesimus and theodic Thebes remaining really unclear to modern scholars. There's also a possibility that Onesimus was evoked in the late ancient church at Aphrodisias, not far from Ephesus and Colossae. And there we have two 5th or 6th century inscriptions that are carved onto white marble column bases at the north aisle of a church site, one that reads Hagios, the other Onesimus. Pavel Nowakowski suggested that these could either be the name of some supplicant or benefactor of the church itself or of the saint. And given its proximity to cities associated with Onesimus in late antiquity, including places like Ephesus and Colossae, I think it's possible to read this as a continuous inscription across these two pillars in reference to the saint. And perhaps some Aphrodisian Christians participated in veneration of Onesimus as a local holy figure. To conclude us here, as Onesimus' story world grew throughout the medieval period and spread within and beyond the Mediterranean world, he became part of a larger liturgical tradition and artistic repertoire of saints. Not everyone had access to the same narratives or versions of Onesimus. Some in the Eastern Mediterranean knew of his shattered legs and speeches before the Eparch Tertullus. Some knew of his exile on an island, or perhaps his role fomenting revolt. And some primarily knew of his relationship to Paul through the letter to Philemon itself. Many of these Onesimus traditions were seemingly pretty unknown to Western academic and ecclesiastical traditions, such that Onesimus was best known and often only known to a lot of the West through the letter to Philemon. So my hope is that scholars of Apocrypha and Christian reception history might start to recognize more the breadth and depth of Onesimus's story world across Afro-Eurasia. Onesimus undoubtedly was deployed as a literary character through whom pre-modern writers sought to articulate their own understandings of slavery, mastery, and piety. He was, in that way, a useful tool for the task, since his rags to riches story as an enslaved person who became a saint, and in some cases a priest, a bishop, or a martyr, allowed some to express their stereotyped ideals of a good slave or a pious slave. And he was at times more than a tool to debate the ethics and theological justification of slavery, and to imagine how enslaved persons participated in Christian history. And for us in the 21st century, I hope we can consider how the flexibility, the expansiveness of Onesimus's story might allow for new narratives to be told about the roles of enslaved persons and other marginalized and oppressed persons in imagining just worlds, in rejecting imperial power, and in developing new sets of religious vocabulary and ethics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk and very illuminating presentation of the rich traditions around the one character, which is plays into the hands of our project so well. We can, whenever you want to jump in with a question, just wave or say so in the chat. I'll start with question happily. So we get a very developed literary dossier around this figure across several medieval languages and several types of collections. A question would be, apart from the presence of shorter narratives in Menologia Do we get places of worship? Can we link the martyrdom to seats of in any culting context? It happens sometimes with figures like this, especially because the text emerged later. I'm very curious what you find.
Yeah, this is something that I've been struggling with, is to outside of kind of the calendrical tradition, seeing if there are moments where we can find that type of veneration. And that's where it's been hardest. I think in some case, the inscription from Miletus is the closest we get to finding kind of a cultic context that also references his martyrdom, where it calls him the Holy Martyr Onesimus. But it's hard to find anything outside of that at this point. That most of what we along with that, for example, on the last slide that I showed is a depiction from Belgrade of the Apostle Onesimus, but we don't really find clear veneration of him outside of this. And I think that's in some ways really fascinating, that he becomes this figure that is eventually incorporated into the calendrical tradition, but in late antiquity doesn't receive this type of, at least doesn't receive that type of literary treatment until we reach the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. I wish I had a better answer outside of we have these epigraphic fragments, and I hope that others are able to do more with them than I can to figure out if we can try to make sense of um, uh, if they were connected to martyrium.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. Sophia, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chance, for that very, very exciting presentation. I myself working on the slavery in Syriac and Greek hagiographies, like mainly female slavery. And so I'm very interested in your work, and I have a number of questions, but I think I will keep it short. First of all, I have a question about these versions, like the longer version and like the one, the earliest and the revised one. Is there any difference between, like a really difference between the depiction of Onesimus as a slave in these versions? I am particularly interested if these versions say something about the time when he was manumitted. Like the Armenian version clearly says that it was after the death of his master, but
Hmm.
is there like in the Greek version there is something about this?
Yeah. The closest that we get in these versions is in both of these cases we get I want to put this. So in the earliest version of it, from the 8th or 9th century, Onesimus is depicted, or at least claims to have been claims to have he positions himself as formerly enslaved to a human, to Philemon, but now is enslaved to Jesus. In the later revision, for some reason, changes this to allow him to continue to be enslaved to Philemon. So he says, well, I am still enslaved to Philemon, even though it's contrary to my human nature, but I'm also enslaved to Jesus. So he kind of positions himself as in like this position of dual ownership. But we don't have the same in the Greek tradition. I'm scanning through to see if there's anything that sticks out, but I don't remember there being any clear moment of manumission in the same way, that it's kind of referenced in his dialogue with Tertullus, but there isn't this, frustratingly, there isn't this same deep interest in the Greek tradition um, around his manumission. Let's see. Just looking through really quick to see if there's anything helpful here. No, I mean, the closest that we get is the martyrdom writer in the earliest version takes a little bit of time to talk about Paul's choice of words in the letter to Philemon, about calling about using the phrases child and brother, and tries to do some like a little bit of commentary on that to kind of justify what does it mean to call Onesimus a child and a brother. But yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't go into the type of detail we would hope to see as it's playing this out, because it's such a big question for earlier patristic writers about how do we talk about Onesimus's status and what does that mean for Christian communities in which there are enslaved persons in the 4th and 5th centuries. But the Byzantine Greek tradition doesn't go into that type of depth, frustratingly.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a maybe a follow-up. I wonder if what what kind of bearings the fact that Onesimus was enslaved has on his preaching, on his activity as an apostle, because it seems to be a very contradicting things. Because I remember in the Acts of Thomas in the Syriac and Greek versions, so basically at a certain point the author just almost drops the idea of slavery, and Thomas functions as a free person moving around and talking to people, doing everything on his own and without any references to his master. And his master is Jesus, of course, but his earthly master. Is there anything like that in Greek version?
Yeah, we do get that a little bit. We're I think that's where I'm so fascinated with this presentation of Onesimus, because I started out with the preface to say the whole story itself is framed around this idea that to kind of claim that enslaved persons are close to the devil in the fact that they both are characterized as rebellious, as runaways, as not to be trusted and kind of not enjoying being under their lord, but if they submit to slavery freely, they are part of this. But throughout the story itself, the kind of the salience of slavery kind of best way to put it maybe is it oscillates a little bit. It kind of goes back and forth where we have instances in Onesimus's dialogue with Tertullus, and later on when he's exiled, that he talks a little bit about, I mean, he's invested in teaching a little bit when in using phrases around being a doulos to a kurios, or accepting despoteia, but also unsurprisingly, the hagiographers also just enjoy using Onesimus as a mouthpiece to continue bashing idolatry, and a lot of his monologue throughout this piece is also just him kind of using stock phrases and motifs around it's bad to sin, it's bad to be an idolater, the Romans are wrong. But yeah, so it's I read it as it has a little bit more salience than some other apocryphal stories where their history, kind of their, how do I want to put this? Their condition in enslavement is kind of secondary to the story itself. In this case, it seems to be more the case, especially because in the dialogue with Tertullus, it bothers Tertullus so much to not understand why this enslaved person has this kind of oratorical authority where they're preaching in Rome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think Andy has a question. I can't hear you. Well, until Andy figures out that thing, I'll throw another one in. So this is a text of the 8th, 9th century. And you've worked on a lot earlier Christianity on terms of enslavement. And my question is the vocabulary in this text, in the later text, more intense in terms of slavery, or more diluted comparing to what you've seen in or any sort of difference of that kind? For instance, did it become by the 9th century like a literary motif, whereas in the early Christianity it was more intense because they really refer to both realities? How is your perception?
Yeah, this is something that I struggled with early on in the project. It's like, okay, I have to learn a lot more about Byzantine slavery than I previously knew. The most helpful thing, at least, is that in recent work in kind of late ancient and Byzantine slavery studies, there's a lot of the work that's been done is mostly been pointing to previously overlooked continuities with kind of Roman and late Roman systems of slavery, to say it's not as simple as we're just moving to kind of an early version of serfdom. But when it comes to the vocabulary itself, I would say it doesn't seem like it's necessarily, how do I want to, this is a good question, because it's the language doesn't seem like it's necessarily too diluted. I think especially because, like, of course, throughout the late Roman period and into the Byzantine period, a term like kurios starts to become well used as a more, just a formal way of saying sir, right? But in a lot of these texts, they specifically, well, they'll use kurios sometimes, but are also very interested in like maintaining despotes as the term to describe the despotes and the soter Jesus Christ. So there's still this interest in not just referring back to kind of what we might think of as like standard Septuagintal or New Testament language of the kurios Jesus Christ, but wanting to pair doulos with another term within this broader range of this kind of semantic range of slavery. So I don't think that it becomes, at least in the Byzantine Greek tradition of this text, doesn't become too diluted. But that's, I think, partially because this story is so focused on and intense about wanting to explain the relationship between slavery and mastery and what Onesimus is doing. Whereas I think, kind of back to Sophia's point with some texts, right, we do have terms like doulos and kurios that are thrown around a little bit more loosely. Of course, this becomes a monastic term that just is, kind of like, oh, poor little me, a diminutive phrase. At least in this text, it seems like there's this kind of blend of kind of wanting to imagine the historical Onesimus as an enslaved person with this kind of theological overlay of what does it mean to be a doulos to God or doulos to Jesus?
Thank you. Very interesting. Andy?
Yeah, thanks. This works now. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions coming from someone who's been working on this Synaxarion for a while now, the Armenian one. So actually, there's two questions. One is I had a brief look at the Greek examples, and the text seems very, very short in comparison. And so normally when I've been looking at the Armenian Synaxarion, it's either a Synaxarion entry translated from Greek and maybe reworked a little bit, or it's a summary of a text that was circulating independently. So have you sort of figured out where the Armenian material is coming from? And then a side question to this, with an interest in the Greek side, is there a lot of variation between the different Greek menologia? Because I've noticed there's some discrepancies there as well, in terms of maybe it's just the Constantinopolitan ones and then from other areas or something like that.
Yeah. So when it comes to where the Armenian tradition is pulling its material from, I hope you can answer that for me, because I don't know. I haven't been able to figure that out yet. But it's been with the other traditions, it's been a little bit easier to trace from like the Greek to the Copto-Arabic to the Ethiopic. But I'm not sure for the Armenian one, and it's really fascinating because it diverges in this way, especially and I think for me it's especially fascinating to see how the text is so invested in not allowing Onesimus to go become Paul's disciple until after Philemon dies. So I'd love to know where this emerges from and how it gets picked up specifically in the Armenian tradition. When it comes to the Greek tradition, yeah, the thing that happens, and Craig Hansen describes this a little bit, and I'm kind of adding a third version to the mix in the book. But this earliest version in the 8th and 9th centuries pops up and then becomes sort of standardized by the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries to be included into Menologia. But there's also this other tradition or this other version of it that I've been working a little bit on that seems to be a little bit more standalone from and doesn't appear as much in Menologia, but in other manuscripts alongside various apocrypha and martyr narratives. But I have not figured out exactly why it's the case that I understand the process of why this somewhat longer earliest version would be shortened and standardized to be entered into as a monologium entry. But I'm not totally sure. This is something I would love to spend more time with, to be able to figure out how to explain the development of these multiple kind of Greek traditions, and if their various uses are coming out of whether or not it's being funneled into a shorter monologium version, or I think the times that we see the shortest versions of these stories in Greek tend to be in prefaces to the letter to Philemon in Byzantine Greek New Testament manuscripts, that we start to get really shortened versions of this story, where it might give like a sentence about Tertullus and Onesimus and a sentence about the shattering of the legs, when there's kind of evidence of them knowing this martyrdom text and tradition, but not going into full detail about it.
Okay,
Marcus?
thank you very much.
Marcus, please.
Okay, sorry, just get that. So thank you for this paper. It's really interesting. I have one question out of curiosity. Do you check for the question of popularity of a saint? Do you check the use of this name in these times? I checked the LGPN database while we were talking, and it has only 16 instances of Onesimus and 11 of them are from Thessaly. So he should have been a very prominent figure there, but at no other place actually. So I was wondering if you have any ideas on this.
Yeah, no, this is something I've been looking into a little bit, and yeah, that's as far as I found as well, is that there seems to be a prominent name around Thessaly, but isn't really elsewhere, which is still really fascinating to me. That, like, I don't know what it is about Theodic Thebes that attaches itself to the Onesimus tradition, because whatever it is whatever's happening there seems to be separate from the martyrdom cycle, that has zero interest in Thessaly, and no reference to this as a place that this would be of importance. So no, I'm sorry to say I don't have a good answer for outside of the literary tradition, how Thessaly becomes the kind of the only place that really seems to latch on to him as a and is using his name in really interesting ways.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chance. This was super interesting, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you more about it, but I can bug you later. But I did have two questions that I wanted to ask now. The first one is just super quick. When you're talking about the original versus the revised versions, is it BHG 1376 original and then BHG 1377 is revised, or is there or something else?
Yes, yeah, that is how I'm kind of, well, I should say I'm borrowing that from Hansen himself, who uses that terminology, original and revised, to describe those exact two BHDs.
Got it. And then the other question is that I have a vague memory that Onesimus appears in some other apocryphal acts. I know the name appears, I think maybe in Philip, but I think it's a different Onesimus. But I think it's this Onesimus appears maybe in Xanthippe and Polyxena. Is that right? Or have you found that?
I haven't been looking into Xanthippe and Polyxena, so I will have to do that. Because I've poked around a little bit in other apocryphal acts, but haven't done a deep dive yet to see when and if Onesimus appears elsewhere, just because he seems to be a fairly minor character throughout late antiquity in apocryphal traditions. And I think in part because there's so much debate in the 4th and 5th centuries about whether or not the letter to Philemon even deserves to be in the canon. It seems like there's given that folks like Chrysostom and Jerome have to fight to even make place for it. I would love to look more, and I think that's something I need to do, is to look more into where apocryphal traditions do take him into account, even in a small way.
Thanks.
I have the closing question as the table gets claimed in 10 minutes. So we're talking about a very developed dossier with many texts in many languages. So I always ask this question: how does the character evolve across the dossier from text to one another? How the relationship to the apostles, which is linked evolves across that. Sometimes you get intensified, sometimes not. And in your case, of course, the same question as for enslaved language across all the traditions about Onesimus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things here is that we, with the way that the character of Onesimus kind of shifts or changes or interacts differently throughout these texts. I think what's fascinating to me is when Paul is or is not a main character in these stories, when you move from the Greek to the Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopic, that he doesn't really get, I mean, he gets, in the Greek tradition, he gets a little bit of space to appear, basically to be the person who writes the letter to Philemon and then disappears from the story altogether. Whereas he gets a little bit more space in the Armenian tradition, and virtually no space in the Ethiopic tradition. So I think what's really fascinating to me is how Paul is decentered in some of the centered or decentered in some of these traditions, where Onesimus kind of gets more breathing room, and same with Philemon, that Philemon sometimes falls to the background and isn't really deemed an important character within this Onesimus story world. And sometimes he's really important, and especially in the Ethiopic tradition, he gets an entire dialogue with Onesimus where he explains how he's going to free him and send him away to Paul to be able to continue to do his work, his missionary work, and that he gives him all of his money and says, "I don't need it anymore. Like, this is all for you." So I think it's fascinating because it gives us a different way to imagine, to try to understand how people in the Eastern Mediterranean were interacting with figures like Paul and Philemon and Onesimus in ways that moved beyond just the letter to Philemon, where I think maybe that's another way to describe this, is that you have this movement from, in the Greek tradition, there's still an interest in the letter to Philemon. This is still like a core piece of explaining how Onesimus became this prominent preacher in Rome and was a martyr. And this starts to get lost a little bit as the tradition moves on, that Paul in his letter fall out of view and Onesimus starts to become a little bit more standalone over time.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation and an illuminating paper, and thanks everyone for joining in the seminar.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciated it.
Very good seeing everyone. See you next time.